Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Vaughn with How She Got There, a Next In podcast. And today, my guest is Jennifer Clevenger, who is the Vice President of Engineering for one of my favorite companies and who I have spent a lot of money with recently, Etsy. Hi, Jennifer.
Yeah,
How are you?
I'm great. Thanks. How are you, Jamie?
I am doing well. Now, I always start out this interview with asking, where did you grow up and what did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
Yes. I grew up in Toronto, Ontario, in Canada. Um, in terms of what did I want to be when I was growing up, it's a really tough question for me. I'm actually not one of those people that knew.
Okay.
I always felt very envious of people who kind of had that certainty. You know, when I was 10, I knew I wanted to be a doctor, and like all roads in my life sort of like led me to this outcome. I think I'm more of a meanderer, and I like to think that there are a lot of people out there that are meandering their way through life as well.
Yeah.
That, you know, you don't hear their stories as often because it doesn't sound as glamorous to say like, oh, you know, I just sort of like put one foot in front of the other and meandered my way. So maybe it's useful to tell you things that I liked when I was a kid, even
Sure.
though I didn't know what I wanted to be. You know, I liked art. I played the drums like in an orchestra, like percussion. I hated the piano, which was the thing my parents wanted me to play. And I was good at studying, like I was good at school. I was good at studying and working hard. But I never really thought hard about what I wanted to be. Although I will say, I think that I never felt like there was something that I couldn't be. So that was nice. You know, it felt like I had choices and options.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about your educational journey. How did you decide to go into tech?
Yeah, great question. So I'm old. There was no computer science in my high school when I was there. So I'd never written a program before I went to university. I also grew up in Toronto in Canada, and I think the process of going to university there is a little different and much simpler. And if I remember correctly, you know, I was in high school and we got an hour in class and everyone got these forms. And you just went through the form and like ranked the universities that you wanted to go to in order of preference and ticked little boxes for the major that you might have wanted. And I remember looking through the majors being like, well, I don't want to be a scientist and I'm squeamish, so I don't think I want to be a doctor. And like computer science, oh, I haven't done that yet. And I went to University of Waterloo. It rolls up under math, the math department. So I have a Bachelor of Mathematics, computer science. And I was like, oh, I like math and I've never done this before. So I ticked that box as my first choice. But again, I think my story doesn't parallel a lot of the stories that I hear, which is, you know, I did this computer thing, or I took a course and I felt really passionate about it and I followed. I just sort of picked it in my meandering way. And then when I got to university, you know, in my first 2 weeks, I realized I had made this horrible mistake. Like I felt like I was totally out of my depth. You know, I was at the school where people, you know, at a time when there wasn't a lot of computer science education before university, the people who were now my classmates were people who like had totally nerded out on this stuff their whole lives and then ended up at the school because they had followed their passion. And here I was, like I had never even written a computer program before. And so I remember very clearly I was in a lab and I was doing one of my assignments or trying to do one of my assignments. I was just in tears. And there's this really nice guy named Tim who was there. And I don't know, he had pity on me or he was just a really nice guy. And he stepped me through how to wrap my head around writing my first object-oriented program. We were doing it in Turing at the time. And so I think if it wasn't for his, you know, help and his kindness, I don't know that I would have made it through that first hump. You know, when I first went to university, I called my mom and I was like, I've made a horrible mistake. You know, I was in tears and I'm like, this isn't for me. And I 100% thought my mom, he was a first generation immigrant, hard work, you know, you do the thing that you're supposed to do and you just persevere. I thought she was going to be like, get off the phone and get back to work. But she said, don't worry, you know, give it a semester, do your best. And if it doesn't work out, then you can come home. And I was so surprised by this, you know, kind of autonomy and freedom that she gave me, that it sort of gave me fuel to, you know, give it my best, do my best. And if it doesn't work out, it's okay. You know, that was like a new concept for me. And so, that's how I started my career in tech.
Uh-huh.
Um, and, uh, and then, after that first semester, I had found my footing. Um, I had made a few friends. I figured out how to write a program or two, and then I made it through. I made it through the rest of the years, and here I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that process is much easier than it is here in America. They
Yeah.
you to have everything picked by kindergarten, now.
Yeah.
That's
Yes. It seems way more high stakes here.
yeah.
And I can't imagine, actually, to be honest, like I can't imagine knowing that early what I would want to be. I'm just not
Mhm.
that person that like knows that much about my future self.
Yeah. Well, I always knew what I wanted to do and what
Yeah.
I wanted to work in, and then sometimes those things don't always work out, or you take a left turn and you're like, "Well, what in the world am I gonna do?" Like, I'm here at a tech company, and I worked in the entertainment world for so many years, and
Yes.
but you know what? Everything I've learned here is working in other areas of my life now that you never would have even thought about. So I think everything works out eventually for the way it's supposed to. But yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
I
could you
totally
change
agree.
was it easy to change your major there? Because I think that would have been something I might have done quickly.
Um, that's a great question. You could definitely change your major if you
Okay.
wanted to. I think it's the same as the process here. Like you would take whatever credits you can use and transfer them over, and whatever you couldn't would become your electives.
Mhm.
But I'm also a person, as meandery as I am. If I'm on a path, I'll usually stay on that path.
Mhm. I
um,
understand.
until something else comes along. Or I'm also a person that never says no to an opportunity. So if
Mhm.
someone comes along and suggests something, I'm like, oh, okay, let's try that.
So after college, how did your career in tech unfold?
Yeah, great question. So I went to a university that had co-op program.
Okay.
Highly recommend if you can find a school that has that. It's a work study program. So that
Mhm.
means that my undergrad was 5 years, and I worked every 4 months, and I went to school every 4 months. It was like
Oh,
four
wow.
months of school, 4 months of work, 4 months of school, 4 months of work. And you do that for 5 years. So by the time you graduate, you have like a whole bunch of these like very rich internships under your belt.
Mhm.
And usually a good Rolodex of people that you can call for a job. And so my first job was my last internship, which is how I ended up here in New York from Toronto. I did an internship at Morgan Stanley, and I came back full time. So I started my career, my full time career in tech in finance.
Mhm.
So I used to write trading software for our internal trading desk. Um, and that was okay. It was a rough time. I graduated in '04. So after like 4 or 5 years, we're into like '08 and '09. And it was kind of a rocky time for financial
Mhm.
services.
Yeah.
And so after Morgan Stanley, I worked at PwC. I wanted to get more into sort of like the people side
Mhm.
of work. When I was at Morgan Stanley, because I was just a pure programmer, um, my job was, just like sit at your desk, put your headphones on, write your code, pump it out. There was
Mhm.
no part of my job that required or rewarded like people development or people skills or communication or anything like that, which are things that I really, really like. And so I missed that. And so I went into consulting and worked in forensic data analytics for a while, PwC.
Mhm.
Um, and then I tried to find, I felt like I had gotten too far away from my computer science roots. I wanted to get back into like a tech company.
Mhm.
But at that time, by then, my resume looked very kind of like corporate fintechy, big banks, and it was
Yeah.
really hard for me to get like smaller tech companies or even the bigger ones to look at my resume and be like, this is a person that could work here.
Right.
And so my hop from PwC to Etsy was a weird one. And I would encourage people to like never give up, or like you never know where opportunities are. I actually applied for a job. I was working at data analytics, and I applied for a job in the analytics organization at Etsy, and I
Mhm.
didn't get the job. It wasn't. I really, really wanted it, but I didn't get it. Super bummed. So I took another offer at MetLife and kind of resolved myself to, not that there's anything wrong with working in large banks, but I was trying to like move away from that,
Mhm.
in large financial institutions. So I took a job at MetLife. And then 6 or 7 months later, someone who had been on that interview panel for the analytics job called me up. His name is Rafe, and he actually was the head of data engineering on the engineering side at Etsy. And he said, hey, I don't know if you remember me, but I was on this interview panel for this other job, and I have a job that's opening, an engineering manager job for one of my teams. And I remembered you, and I wanted to know if you would come and interview for this job. And I was like, so ecstatic. This is the job that I wanted, and I went and interviewed for that job. So that is how I ended up at Etsy, like kind of like this weird meandering path, if you will.
Yeah. You never know who you're going to meet.
You never know.
Yeah.
You never know.
Yeah. And you never know what your impression is going to be on somebody.
Yeah, exactly. Like clearly I failed this analytics interview, but there was like a single person on this panel. He was like, this is the person that I'm going to remember 6 months from now when I have another job. Yeah.
I love that. I love when things that you think aren't working out actually do.
Yes.
So tell me, what does a day in the life of a VP of engineering entail at Etsy?
Great question. So I think there are kind of like probably two big chunks of my job. One of them is organizational design and organizational strategy. Okay. So the orgs that I lead, do they have a good vision? Are they set up for success? Do we have the right kind of like mission in place? Do people understand what we're doing and how we measure our success? Mm-hmm. At Etsy, I've always been on the infrastructure side. And so it is harder for infrastructure teams to measure and talk about successes. Mm-hmm. Versus, for example, on the product side, you might have some really easy to measure KPIs like revenue or, number of visits that you're driving. So those are things that we try and think about in order to make sure that our teams are well supported and well understood within the larger organization. And then people management is the second really, really big thing. Like, I think that's one thing that Etsy does really well. We invest in our people. We invest in the development of the people who are supposed to care about the people. So there's a really great engineering managers and directors and VPs track. Where the focus is kind of like on coaching and career support and helping people to be like their best selves at work so that they can, have a fun and fulfilling life. You spend so many hours at work. So that balance should really be something that's reflected in your day-to-day.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would love to learn from you any career lessons that you've learned or advice that you would have for our viewers.
Yeah. So many to choose from.
Yes.
So I think one probably ties into what I was talking about before. And I think one thing that I learned, so I've been at Etsy for 7 years. One thing that I learned after having joined Etsy is that everyone contributes differently, but every contribution counts.
Yes.
So like maybe I'll tell a story. When I was working at Morgan Stanley, so we wrote fixed income trading software. There were multiple different ways that you can contribute to the software. We wrote it internally and launched it internally. There's the back end in Java and C++, and then there's a front end UI in C#. It was just all software developers. So there are no back then there were no UX designers or user experience researchers. We didn't have any of that. So the engineers were writing the user experience and the GUI and the UI. And everybody wanted the back end jobs. So, when it's time to dole out the work, the stereotype was that working in the back end in Java and C++, those were the highly coveted jobs. So of course I always wanted to work on those. So I'd always put up my hand for that type of work. But deep down, I actually really liked the UI and GUI side of the work because I'm a very visual person. I love art. I care about the user experience. I love talking to people. But I never put my hand up for those jobs because they weren't quote unquote technical enough. I think people say that a lot, right? Is that technical enough? Or are you technical enough? Or yada, yada. And so something about that stereotype kept me from wanting to contribute using my strengths, which is something I care about, a delightful user experience, and then creating that for the front end.
Yes, which is what we all want.
Which is what everyone wants in the end, right? And so I should have celebrated the things that I was strong at and realized that hey, not everyone has that strength. And so maybe people aren't putting up their hand for it because they actually aren't good at it or they don't enjoy it. And because it is something that I enjoy, I should lean into that, lean into those strengths. And it's still programming. And then I'm doing something that is elevating the entire product because I'm like filling a gap that doesn't exist and that I actually am good at and I enjoy. And so, like, I guess what I'm saying in like many, many words is that diversity in the workplace matters. You know, every shape matters, like diversity of thought, diversity of preferences, diversity of everything. The more people that you have, like, the more likely it is that you'll fill out the entire puzzle. Like every puzzle piece has to look different. And so I think that's a really, really big lesson that I've learned. Like, lean into your strengths, practice your weaknesses, totally 100%, but like lean into those strengths and use them to help you to get where you want to go. And that every contribution matters, even if they seem like they're not the ones that are the popular ones. Like every contribution is necessary and matters.
That's great.
I think I know I said a million. I'm going to just do 2.
Okay.
I think
we'll take a million now.
We'll be here all day. I think the second one, and it probably also feeds into the top one, but I think as a person who is a people manager, I have learned this lesson that culture really matters, like the culture of your workplace. And as a person that originally started my career in financial services, it's hardly even fintech. It's like, you know, the software development team inside of a large institutional bank. Where culture really didn't matter at all, to be totally honest. Like maybe it's different now, it's been a long time, but back then it sure as heck did not matter. I think like the care and feeding of the people that you work with every single day, to the extent that it is your job, or even if it's not and you're just a peer, I think that really, really matters. And like Etsy is the first company that I've worked at where people prioritize that healthy culture. And that means everything from like psychological safety to being your whole self at work, you know, prioritizing work-life balance, caring about others. These are all things that are really, really important to me. And I push them in the daily, and I encourage everyone that I talk to push for them too, because we spend so much time at work, and you should be enjoyed and feel respected and thriving in the place where you choose to spend so many hours of your life. And it's not something that will happen unless like there's groundswell, like it's the people who will push for a healthy culture. And so I think that's another really, really big lesson.
Yeah, very true. If you're going to spend 8-9 hours a day in an office, you better like where you are.
Yes. I saw this article yesterday. Someone did some research and like drew some graphs about how much time you spend with different people in your life. And they're like, mostly the graphs go up and then down. So like how much time you spend with your parents, you know, when you're young, it's like tons and tons and tons. And then very, very little after a certain age. How much time you spend with your friends, you know, it kind of like also same kind of goes up and then comes back down, usually around the time you have kids and get married. How much time do you spend with your spouse? It's like very little, but then once you meet them, you spend so much time with them, you know, like, and it's very, very consistent. And one of them was how much time you spend at work. And it was the one graph that sort of like went up and then was like consistent for a really, really long time until you retire, you know? And so like all these relationships in your life ebb and flow and you're in and out of them. But being at work is a consistent, and you spend so much of your time and energy, like it's impossible for that not to shape you and for it not to be like an integral piece of your life. So I think people need to ask themselves, like, not to be morbid, but if I die tomorrow, like, am I happy with how I split my time between like my family, my friends, and my coworkers, you know?
Yeah, very true.
Yeah.
So Jennifer, how do you think we get more women involved in the tech arena?
That is a really, really great question. So I think if in a perfect world, we start with kids, babies, when they're young, and make sure that we reiterate that message to every kid that like, hey, you can be anything and it's not about gender. I think that is going to take generations to continue to make sure that every kid is getting that message. But I feel like I was lucky in that I had an ungendered view of my potential. So I never thought, I know it was a very male dominated field. I went to a math and computer science university. There are very, very few women in my class, but it didn't cross my mind, you know, that I was doing something that was out of the norm for my gender. And that's what I think all kids should have from the very beginning. Because then you don't have to fight this fight later on about like, should I, could I, do I belong? but because we don't live in a perfect world,
Right.
I think we have to inject aggressively in the middle, coupled with that, bringing up the next generation as a generation of kids who see no barriers for themselves from a gender perspective. So Etsy does a really good job of this. We do a lot of recruiting at school. So you try and get kids in when they're, like in internships or like when they're still navigating before they get into their professional lives. Exposures like these podcasts, like different conference talks. Like I think it's really important. Representation absolutely matters. I think over the past few years, like being an Asian Canadian or Asian North American, I think has really changed the narrative for me in a way that there was no vocabulary for it when we were growing up. And so I think recognizing and seeing other people who are like you doing things, all the things, not just the stereotype things, is a huge, huge way. And so that's why I was really excited to do this podcast with you.
Thank you.
And then I think another really effective way to inject kind of like in the middle is to support career changer programs. Because I know a lot of people, and Etsy does a really great job of this too, who have switched careers halfway through and gone to like a Grace Hopper program or it used to be called Recurse Center. I don't remember what it's called anymore, but there are all these programs where you can go and train and change your career partway through, but then you need companies that support these programs to give you a foot in the door to get a job as a person who wasn't trained and doesn't have a degree in computer science or whatever. And so I think all of these interventions are super important. And I also think since, for what it's worth, it's not just about gender. It's kind of like about all the underrepresented minorities and all of the different axes. There are so many.
Yeah.
And it's important to kind of like help bring up the population or the diversity in the workplace to match what it is in your demographic where you live. I think that it should feel natural. Like it's the same everywhere you look.
Yeah. I completely understand that.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this interview, I always love to ask our guests, what inspires you? And it can be anything. It doesn't have to be a workplace. If there's just something out there that gets you going.
That's a really tough question. And I don't know if there's like any one thing or person that inspires me, but I feel like I get little bursts of energy and inspiration on the daily from people who like continue to find optimism and gratitude in the daily grind, if you will. There's just like so much stuff going on all the time, and there's so little that we have control over. And it's so easy to be dissatisfied with what you have. There's so many reasons to be stressed or dissatisfied. And so people who find optimism. So I think like if I'm going to give a shout out to my husband, he is a person who I feel like is constantly stopping to recognize and point at the reasons that we're lucky, and I think that is something that continues to give me energy every day. Even sometimes when my kids, like I give them something dumb that is nothing at all, and they're like so grateful. I feel like, oh, I'm so happy that you're grateful for this like pencil topper that I picked up at the dollar store for you. Like I feel like that's really wonderful. And then the second thing is people who like are unafraid of change and reinvent themselves. Who just kind of like live their lives as an adventure. I said a few times, I'm like a meander, but maybe I'm like an adventurer. Like, I know this is so cliche. People say like life is a journey, not a destination. And especially live in New York, like it's a grind. And there's so many brilliant, smart A-type personality people who come here to get somewhere. And so they're just like razor focused on the destination. And I think that's like, I wish people would spend more time enjoying the highs and lows of life. Because the lows make the highs feel like bliss. And then the highs will make the lows feel a little lower, but everyone learns from, pain and heartache. And so I feel like I also want to embrace those times when things are really, really difficult. So I like people who kind of like, I feel inspired by people who reinvent themselves even in the most difficult of circumstances.
Yeah. I like that advice. That's a good one to look for.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Jennifer, I have absolutely loved our time getting to know you. you and cannot wait to see what's next for you. And I am an avid customer of Etsy, so excited to know that we know someone there now.
Yep.
Yep. And thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today.
My pleasure. It was wonderful speaking to you too, Jamie.